Hi, I'm Rob Abbott. I'm a software developer here at Livefront. This is React to React Native. As a developer that recently made the transition, I sometimes get asked the question, how are they different? My answer usually begins with something along the lines of, it feels like they're almost the same thing. This is because in React Native, the developer still writes a lot of the same JavaScript code. And in that sense, I believe front-end developers will find the transition more natural than native developers. While this might sound encouraging to any React developers that haven't taken up native yet, and it should, there are still some key differences to be aware of when making the transition. I'm going to highlight a few of these areas and finish with some similarities and final thoughts. The first area is components. One of the basic and most obvious differences is that React Native does not support HTML. Instead, it has base components that are imported and used to form the structure of a layout. For instance, a div is a commonly used element in React, but in React Native, we use an imported component called View. React Native uses this component to render native markup for both iOS and Android. While a div and View component look different, the fundamental way we use them remains mostly the same. They are both used as container type elements for styling purposes and additional content, which should feel familiar for React developers. Builds and deployment. Another clear difference revolves around deployments. Deploying a React application can be as simple as uploading your project files to a web server and accessing them from a connected domain name. However, with React Native, there are app stores that require providing data like a build version, a digital signature for iOS, and a secure key for Android. The React Native website has helpful documentation around the deployment process, but basic knowledge of both Xcode and Android Studio go a long way here. This might be the most important area of React Native where it would be valuable to have native development experience or a native resource you could tap into. Those without native experience will be happy to hear that once the deployment pipeline is in place, it likely won't require much ongoing upkeep. Styling. Styling a React Native application has some overlap with standard React and CSS-like properties, but the primary distinction is in how the styles are saved and applied. Instead of importing a CSS file, React Native requires the developer to create an object of individual key value pairs. Each key in the style object refers to a CSS-like property. For instance, align-items in CSS becomes align items in lower camel case. After the style object has been created, it can then be applied to the style prop of any React Native component. The good news here is that React Native has support for many common CSS properties and even does a good job with Flexbox style layouts, which web developers should find familiar. Debugging. Browsers are familiar territory for React developers. We are accustomed to the dev tools they provide and what their limitations are, but React Native apps are displayed on native devices. So how do we load a React Native app locally and debug it without a browser? A combination of simulators and real devices are the answer. Xcode is integrated seamlessly with the Mac Simulator app, which is a useful tool for debugging applications in a variety of iPhone and iOS versions. Android Studio takes a similar approach, with various native emulators that can be installed and selected. Of course, you can also use a physical device by connecting it to your machine and choosing it prior to the build process. Even though we aren't using a browser, we are still writing JavaScript. So all of your standard console commands are available for outputting data in the terminal. Feel free to console log away. Similarities. Like comparing any two frameworks, there are additional quirks and subtle differences between React and React Native, but at its core, it's still just JavaScript. Building components and passing data via props are implemented in the same way. React hooks and lifecycle methods remain unchanged, and managing state with libraries like Redux can be approached in the same manner. So while it would be beneficial to have native experience, it is by no means a requirement when developing for React Native, because most of the logic in the application is still handled by React. Final thoughts. React Native opens the doors for React developers to build applications on native platforms. And while React Native might have some limitations when compared to its truly native counterparts, there is no understating its ability to support the same application on multiple platforms from a single code base. React developers should feel empowered by the efficiencies this can create for your project, and I hope this means you'll take the jump into native.